Hi, hello again. Um, Today, of course, I'm going to continue with the narrative. We're way ahead in terms of where we should be. So I have a lot to say today that I will get to the um, barbarian invasions and continue the story of the decline. But in the first place, I want to deal with the review question as I always do. To prep you. And so let's begin with question 20. Historically speaking, the term Hebrew and Jew are not synonymous. Explain. So in tackling this question, I think a good place to begin is with the so-called Babylonian exile between 586 and 532 BC. And you'll recall that the Hebrews, the Judean kingdom was extinguished by the Neo-Babylonians in 586 BC, and many, not all, but many were brought by the Neo-Babylonians to Mesopotamia, and they were, quote unquote, liberated by the Persians in 532 BC. Now, it's in this period is really decisive. The experience of these exiles in Mesopotamia in terms of the development of Judaism as a religion and the development of the Jews as an ethnicity. Because they came from Judea, the Mesopotamians referred to them as Judeans or eventually Jews. It was in exile that the reference to Jews began. And this experience, some of the Jews went back to Palestine when the Persians allowed them to go back and to rebuild the temple after 532. But many actually remained in Mesopotamia or Iraq. And as I said in the past, Jews lived in Iraq until the early 1950s. This was a very important Jewish community. And it was there that, first of all, we're pretty sure that Isaiah, the prophet, he preached in exile in Mesopotamia, and he completed the evolution of the prophetic literature, and he basically came to the idea of ethical monotheism, as I explained previously. I'm not going to go into that. You have to look in your notes. This was also the place where they began to bring together the books of the Old Testament, and they were written down. A lot of the Old Testament was written down in this period. And finally, we can say that being in exile and away, you get the emergence of the rabbis, and synagogue Judaism really begin to Mesopotamia. And the Jews, who up to this point had been essentially farmers and pastoralists, they become an urban people, and they become essentially merchants and craftsmen, which is, of course, remains characteristic of most of the Jews from here on in. And of course, they spread outside of Palestine, all over the Middle East and throughout the Mediterranean in the course of the following centuries. So, in terms of the history of the term Jews and so on, the development of the concept of the Jew as a sort of diasporic people based on synagogues and rabbis, this is where it starts. But of course, one should also mention the fact that certainly in Palestine, you have continued to be the Sadducees, the Zealots, the Essenes. These emerge over the centuries, especially from the 2nd century BC onwards. So that's why, so the whole emergence of the concept of the Jew appears with the Babylonian exile and the aftermath. And then dealing with the concept of the Hebrews essentially refers to what they were previously, prior to this exile. And we know that really the Hebrews, they started out, the first reference to them are two references to sort of marginal pastoralists in the Bronze Age, in the late Bronze Age, prior to 1100 BC. Certainly they were a Semitic community, but they were sort of like Bedouin, I would say. That's the best analogy I can make. They kept livestock. They made their living in livestock. Occasionally they engaged in raiding and so on. They were a pest to the urban communities, the farmers in Mesopotamia. Some of them went down into Egypt. You have then the formation of the covenant in the 12th century BC. A tribal confederacy is formed under the auspices of Moses, and eventually they liberate themselves from Egypt. They occupy the so-called Promised Land, Canaan, Palestine. And Jehovah is originally a tribal god who in the 10th century, you have that changes, and you have the foundation of the Hebrew monarchy with Saul and David and Solomon, the building of the temple. It becomes a priestly sort of a temple religion from the 10th century onwards. Then finally, you have the splitting up of the unity of the 12 tribes into two kingdoms, kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Judah. Israel disappears in 1722 by the Assyrians, and then the Neo-Babylonians destroy the monarchy of Judea. In the course of that period, especially between the 8th and the 6th century, that's the age of the prophets, which eventually leads back to Isaiah. That's basically the outline of that. Are there any questions about that? Okay, we can move on. And I want to say, first of all, of course, you got your essays back, and looking over the grades, I see that they were very strong. Many people did well. And that's good. I can see that people are taking things seriously and learning something, and that's very good. I guess then you'll be getting your exams back very shortly as well. And if you have questions in the first place, address them to the marker, and then come to me if there's a problem. Now, they should be on Umlearn. I'm referring to the chats. I saw the essays, marked essays were on Umlearn. Uh, so you should be able to find your essay and there should be a mark. If there's a problem, let me know, please. Okay. I'll double check and make sure that um, things are okay. Some students are complaining, I see, and so on. I'll try to take care of it. Okay. So, okay, now I'm going to, in the first place, I'm going to make certain remarks today. As I said, we're quite up to date in terms of the lectures and so on, and I think I'm certain that I can bring you right through the Middle Ages to the beginning of modern times, which is, of course, the end goal in this narrative that we're presenting in this course. So we're okay. I just wanted to say, I want to say something about use of sources in the first place. I want to talk about the use of historical sources. That's the way I want to begin today. But before I do that, I want to say something else, which bears directly on your lives. And I am dealing with your lives, dealing with my life as well. And we have to pay attention. I have been referring to the present because we are in a critical or even a crisis period. I've been harking back on this all through the term. And indeed, at the beginning of the term, I told you that I thought we were in a serious crisis. Well, something has happened in the United States which is quite important in terms of people's lives in Canada, and especially young people, because the Biden administration has passed this piece of legislation, this aid package of some $2 trillion is going to be distributed, and most of it is going to not to corporations, but to ordinary individuals in the United States are going to benefit directly, to the tune of something like, according to what I've been reading, every family will get about, in the next year, something like $50,000 from the US government. Now that is an enormous amount in terms of demand. That is a huge expenditure. It's serious money, and it's going to really lift and provide a base for a lot of people who really have fallen between the cracks. How right you are. When everyone is rich, no one is rich. That's exactly it. So the thing is that this is a massive government intervention, unprecedented, and it's an attempt to basically salvage the system, which has fallen into a deep crisis, and a multidimensional crisis. And so the United States, the establishment there is taking serious measures to try, using Keynesian techniques, to basically spend their way out of the situation. Of course, they're going to incur even more debt. They have large debts, so does Canada. But what they're going to try to do is grow their way out of the debt. Whether it will work or not, I have no idea at this point. But I do know that in the short run, at least, it's going to create a lot of demand in the economy. We can expect inflation. Food prices are going to rise. Commodity prices are going to rise. That's going to hit incomes. But on the other hand, it's going to be offset by the fact that in the short run, there's going to be a huge amount of demand and also jobs. Furthermore, the inflation is going to basically wipe out a considerable amount of the debt. So basically what this comes down to is that the poor and young people, there's going to be a lot of opportunity. There are going to be jobs. And this is going to have a spillover into certainly in the Canadian economy. There will be more opportunities for young people than we've seen. I mean, this is the end of neoliberalism, folks. This is the end of it. And the first of all, there's going to be a spin. There's going to be the Canadian economy is going to be affected by what's happening in the States, but also there's going to be political pressure on Trudeau. He's already done. He's been spending a lot of money, but he probably is going to have to spend a lot more. And so this is it's a new day, as I can say, and it's no thanks to the neoclassical economists who have been teaching in the universities for decades now. Austerity is the answer. Well, it's a repudiation of all this. You're going to be taking these economics courses because you need a job, but you should look at this in a very critical way. So that's what I wanted to say about that. And I mention it because it's so damn important to all our lives. So with that, I want to turn now to back to history, but I'm going to, as I say, we're well ahead of ourselves. I want to take some time to sort of, before I get back into the matter, I want to talk about historical sources. What you did in this essay was, it was your first exposure to working with historical sources. Historians use sources to basically develop narratives. They, in the same way you try to develop a kind of critical view of the historical sources that I gave you for the life of Jesus and the life of Socrates, no matter what the historical subject is, since the 19th century, all history has been based on what we can call source critique or source criticism. Now, to give you an example of that, like, let's take the history of Manitoba and history of Canada, the history of Winnipeg as an example. If you look at what was written about the history of Winnipeg and Manitoba until very recently, the last 15 or 20 years, a lot of it is pretty sketchy. And there was some use of sources and beginnings of sort of a more deeper look at sources and so on. But it's only in the last 20 years that well-trained historians have begun to do the history of Manitoba and Winnipeg. And in order to do that, you have to go to the Manitoba archives or to the city archives of Winnipeg or to the Hudson's Bay archive, and you basically work with the documents in the same way as you worked with the documents bearing on the life of Jesus and Socrates. It's a source-based criticism. That's why I put I gave you this first essay to sort of introduce you to. This is the meat and potatoes of a historical work. Now, I want to talk a little bit about my own experience in the archive, because first of all, I recollect it with great pleasure. And also it sort of brings you, I have now written something like 10 or 11 books, and many of them have been based on archival work. And I just want to tell you the story of my experiences with the archive because it's kind of interesting. My area of specialization, all professional historians today have an area of specialization, and mine was early modern France. I've always liked France as a culture, and when I was a graduate student, I became very enthusiastic about sort of the history of France And so I ended up, I had a PhD director. I was at Cornell University, and this guy, he told me he was interested in certain subjects that dealt with 16th century France. So he said, well, why don't you look at the beginnings of Protestantism in France in the 16th century? Uh, Protestantism began in France, and Luther comes along. Maybe we'll get down to Luther at the end of this course, but in France, there was this character, John Calvin, who basically was responsible for the implantation of Protestantism in France. So there was, but even before Calvin, a certain group of what we call evangelicals who wanted to go back to the Bible, the basis of the Christian religion. And he assigned me this topic. I didn't know what I was doing. And he was steeped in the history of this. And so I followed his lead. In any case, the topic started out in quite a dry way. I was basically looking at theological works that were written and published at the time, the beginning of the Reformation. So I was studying both Latin and French texts, which sort of, you could see that the people who are writing these texts were more and more interested in the Bible. But the idea of the thesis was basically you'll analyze their ideas and how basically these early glimmerings of the Protestant religion turned into, with Calvin, serious Protestantism began to emerge in France. That was the subject given. So I dutifully, and I have to stress, I was an obedient student, let me tell you. I began to pursue this, but as I went along, I realized that there was a whole political dimension to this subject that has been completely overlooked. And so, as it turned out, I wrote this thesis, and it had it certainly was religious, but I gave it a political, because I found new material, and rationally it fit into a certain political context. And so that was my thesis, and I completed it, and eventually most of it was published. But I was not completely satisfied, because I thought to myself, well, there must be more to this. Okay, it's politics, and it's theology, the history of ideas. This kind of history is known as the history of ideas. And since I was at Cornell and we were still in the Cold War, looking at things, especially if you were a European historian, and trying to find social and economic background, it wasn't prohibited, but it was looked upon with suspicion by the establishment. If you wrote serious social and economic history, you were people. I'm talking about the history profession. I'm not talking about the police or anything like that. They looked askance at that kind of an approach. But I, frankly, being a product of the 1960s, I was determined to press on. And I did look. Eventually, I went back to France, and believe me, it's first of all, I wanted to go back to France because it's very beautiful there. The cafes are wonderful, and it's a pleasure to live there. So I went and I began to fish around in the archives, and ultimately I discovered a whole series of documents in the National Library in France, but also in the so-called police archives of Paris. There was already a police in the 16th century, if you can believe it. And when I went to these archives that nobody had used, I discovered all these disturbances, social disturbances, accompanying the intellectuals and the political leaders. Underneath, there was a lot of social agitation going on. and nobody had ever done this. I was able to sort of find in the sources these kinds of materials, and as a result, I was able to produce basically a social history of French Protestantism, but also eventually of Catholicism in the 16th century. That was my early research. And say it was all based on the archives. And so this is what you need to do in terms of doing historical work, is to push the archival research as deeply as possible. And it's a wonderful thing to do, because searching through these old documents and books is extremely pleasurable. It's like a treasure hunt. You find all sorts of amazing stuff in the archives, and it's this kind of discovery. You're turning over the archivists bring you boxes of documents. You turn them over, and suddenly you find these treasures in the documents, and everything is illuminated by discovery. But I want to say now that the thing is that certainly this was a hunt for facts, new facts that were unknown, which is indispensable to new research, to making breakthroughs in research. But you need a theory, you need some sort of a model, you need some sort of a framework, an intellectual framework. You need a hypothesis. In other words, what I'm trying to say is we need facts all the time. We need new facts, but we can only make sense of these facts if we have a theory, and good theory, in order to sort of understand these facts. So what I'm basically getting at is we need a combination of respect for the facts and a good hypotheses and good theory in order to do history. Now, to come to the second essay that you're doing, you've had your dose of source work. Now, in the second essay, what I'm looking for is a sense of creating an intellectual framework out of this. You have some knowledge of the sources, and what you have to do is form them into a second essay. And basically, I would say the key hypothesis that you're working with in doing the second essay is essentially you're looking at the importance of temple religion, the temple religions of the ancient world, whether we're talking about the temple in Jerusalem, or we're talking about the temple religions of the time of Socrates. These institutions, of course, they had a spiritual or religious meaning, but they were also highly political institutions. And you proved your loyalty to the city-state, or you proved your loyalty to Judaism by basically worshiping and even giving money to the temple. And if you were in violation of those norms, in some sense, you got into trouble with the political authorities. I would say that there are other dimensions, of course, to your essay, but I would say that sort of examining and working with that will ensure your success in constructing into some sort of coherent essay. So that's what I would say. Theory and facts go together. They're dialectically related to one another. So that's basically what I want to say now about all of that. Now, having given you this spiel, I want now to go back to the narrative that we've been advancing. And what I want to do now, we have some time, is to sort of go before we get into the what I'm looking towards is the first wave of barbarian invasions. That's what we're essentially. If you see this this map on the screen, you can see. I might as well refer to this. You can see the Roman Empire at its height. This is still the good days of the Roman Empire. And you can see that here's in pink is the empire. To the north is Greater Germania. We shouldn't think of this as modern Germany, not at all. All of these people were divided into so-called tribes. And to the east of them were another people, the Sarmatians, who basically were all through the Greek period and into the Roman period. To the east of Germania were the Sarmatians. In any case, and what was going to happen was in the 3rd century, at the time of the civil wars that I described, these people some of them would break out and invade Gallia, France, invade Italy, and invade the Balkans and even Asia Minor. And this, together with the civil wars between the legions and the economic crisis, created an extremely dire situation, which was retrieved by the emperors Diocletian and Constantine. They were able to turn back by desperate measures this first German invasion. But ultimately, of course, the second German invasion finished off the empire, which I will narrate in due course. But before I get to all that, I want to talk a little bit more in detail about the whole question of money, of gold, of slaves, which I mentioned very briefly. I did go into some detail about the reasons for the decline of the empire. And of course, my lectures online is very important in terms of mastering this nurture. If you look at the last lecture and the discussion of the decline, it's all there. There's 1 or 2 essay review questions that bear in this, but it's all in the last lecture. But I just want to go into this whole question of gold and slaves, because it's important in terms of understanding the collapse of the Roman Empire, but also some of the dynamics which ultimately led to sort of the birth of modern Europe. You'll understand this in a minute. Well, in the course of mentioning all the combination of incredible difficulties that the empire experienced in the 3rd century, the plague, the population decline, I noted that the cities and markets declined drastically. 1/3 of the population was lost. You only have about 45 million people left, starting from 70 million at the end of the 3rd century. But one of the problems was there was not enough money to maintain markets. Money in the Roman Empire was backed by gold. Remember, the Athenians used silver, but the Romans used gold, and they used slaves to operate gold mines in various places. Spain was a particular source, but also Africa was a particular source of gold. Gold mines. Well, I would note that with the decline of slaves, these gold mines were worked by slaves. When the slaves died off, there was nobody to work the mines. Moreover, the Romans, because of slavery, didn't have the machinery to dig more deeply into the earth in order to find new veins of ore, of gold ore, to supply money. So what you have happening in the 3rd century, it's a shortage of gold to back the money. And the result is that the government had to, in order to maintain the legions, which were absolutely necessary, in order to pay them, they just debased the currency. They put less and less gold into the coins as a result, because they didn't have the gold. And the result was a kind of runaway inflation. Now, this is important because with the absence, it's not only that the cities, that the merchants are being attacked and taxed to death, and that the cities are declining, but also the money is worth less and less, and people are increasingly reluctant to participate in the market. They lose confidence in the market. The thing is that the combination of all these things basically leads to the wealthy people who are essentially the landowners, they're still there, to leave the cities, to withdraw from the market, and to ultimately begin to sort of try and become as self-sufficient as possible, so that on their estates, they build mansions, like the McMansions on the edge of Winnipeg, and they try to make themselves as self-sufficient. They grow their own food using peasants and slaves who are immediately dependent on them. And they less and less participate. They no longer go to the cities. The cities are unsafe and there's nothing there. So they begin to live a kind of a life barricaded in their villas, if you like, in their manor houses. Now, this trend is already present in the 3rd century, but it gets worse and worse as conditions worsen. 4th century, 5th century, 6th century, soon you do continue to have a landed aristocracy, and that even despite the barbarian invasions. But these people are no longer city dwellers, as was the elite of the ancient world. They basically live in the countryside with their servants, their slaves, and their peasants, cut off from the rest of the world. And you have basically an economy which is what we call autarchic. There's the market disappears basically for all practical purposes. And this becomes the foundation in Western Europe for basically what we call the Middle Ages, which are based on this economically self-sufficient system run by the nobility or the aristocracy, and which we overall give the name feudalism or Western feudalism to. This is happening in Western Europe. All of that I have said does not apply to the Balkans, to Turkey, to Mesopotamia, and to Egypt. No, in these areas, the market economy and the state does survive. There's a fundamental division starting essentially at the end of the 3rd century, but growing more and more important in the succeeding centuries, where the West basically reverts to a kind of subsistence economy with no cities and no markets and no money, whereas all of this continues in the East. And even a state, a powerful state, survives in the East. And in the East, whereas in the West, we have Western feudalism, in the East, we have what is called the East Roman Empire, which survives right through the Middle Ages. It's called the East Roman Empire or the Byzantine Empire. Byzantium was a little town located roughly here.
Professor, you're not sharing your screen.
What's that?
We can't see anything because you're not sharing your
Oh, you
screen.
can't see it?
No.
Hold on. Can you see it now? Can you see this map?
No.
You cannot see the map.
You're not sharing your screen. That's probably why you can't see it.
Why can't you see it?
You are not sharing your screen.
I'll show the map next time. In any case, the eastern part of the Roman Empire survives as the Byzantine Empire, with a state and with a market economy, which is under state control. The thing is that this is I just would add about this Byzantine state. It certainly based the emperors who continued to rule this state. The capital was called Constantinople, and I'll explain that in a minute. But they certainly saw them as direct continuators of the Roman Empire, and that was true. Constantine, who created this state, was a Roman emperor. But very important to this Byzantine Empire was the fact that it was founded on Christianity, what we have called the Orthodox version of Christianity, and Greek culture. So there are three elements to this Byzantine Empire. There is Greek culture, there is the Christian church, and there is the Roman state and Roman law, while the West falls into darkness, into autarchy, and goes under the onslaught of the barbarian invasions. The Eastern Roman Empire continues right on to the end of the Middle Ages. That's the fundamental distinction. And what I would say, as a result of all of this, you have really the cessation of eventually all trade in the Western Mediterranean basically disappears as a result. So having sort of given you a sense of what happens, I wish now to deal with the first wave of barbarian invasions. Now, in order to understand this, if you think in your mind of the outline of the Roman Empire, to the north, the Roman Empire, the Rhine River separated what was everything that was part of the Roman Empire from what was called Germania, the land of the Germans, the land of the tribes who basically spoke one or another dialect of the early German language. This is all that it means. These people were organized into separate tribes. Sometimes they were fighting one another. So the Rhine River and the Danube River separate the Roman Empire from so-called Germania. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the nature of these tribes because they're important. These people show up in the documents, in Roman documents, as early as the 2nd century BC, way back in the period of the the wars against Carthage. They begin to be mentioned in the documents. And these people lived for centuries in proximity to the Romans, and they became essentially agriculturalists. Just like most of the peasants in the Roman Empire, most of the people who were German were making their living through agriculture. This was their main activity, but most of these people then were peasants, but there did exist a certain warrior aristocracy, and there were chiefs. All of these different tribes had a warrior aristocracy and chiefs, and the common people responded to the call to go to war or to defend the land made by the chiefs and the nobility. And I would also say there was an element even of democracy here, because most of these tribes had popular assemblies. And unlike in Rome, where all of this faded out, amongst the German people, there was a certain democratic element in the political life of these people. Now, living in juxtaposition to the Romans, they began to trade with the Romans in the course of the century. There was a trade going on across the frontiers, and they also picked up some of the Roman military techniques in the course of time. So that is essentially what I would say about these Germans. And the thing is that the reason why they invaded the Roman Empire was, first of all, it was a tempting target, but secondly, there was a growing shortage of land within Germany. The population built up, and more land was needed by these tribal peoples. So there was this tendency to expand. And since the Roman Empire was getting weaker and weaker and couldn't defend itself, that essentially was the underlying driving force that led to the invasion, also the weakness of the Roman Empire. Now, you'll recall that by the middle of the 3rd century, civil war was raging throughout the legions were at war with one another, their generals and so on. And it was, you see that in the first place, in this region here, by this time, that is to say, I'm talking about the Middle Danube, north of the Middle Danube, which is part of Germany. The people who lived in this region were known as the Goths. They were a big German tribe, the Goths, Goths. In 250, in the midst of the Roman crisis, they invaded the central provinces of the Roman Empire. And one of the emperors assembled an army. This is the year 250 to try and beat them back. But in fact, the Goths defeated the Roman legions, killed the emperor, and the Goths now, with nothing in their way, raided down into Greece and into Asia Minor in the year 250. They even invaded some of the Greek islands in the Mediterranean. So there was this breach in the empire in the year 250. Now that happened, and having happened, 6 years later, in 256, the German tribe living in today what is called West Germany and part of Holland, this group known as the Franks, this is in 256, they invaded Gallia or France. And in the south, near Switzerland, another German tribe known as the Alemanni, taking their cue from the success of the Franks, they invaded Italy. Northern Italy was temporarily occupied by these so-called Alemanni. So the Goths, the Franks and Alemanni basically breached the frontiers of the empire in the midst of this calamity? Well, to cut a long story short, the Roman Empire at this point rallied, and it rallied because it threw up two leaders, one of them named Diocletian, who I've mentioned, the other Constantine, who I also mentioned, and they reorganized the empire, brought the legions under the control, and were able to throw back the barbarians. But in order to do this, and I'm coming close to the end, they had to completely reorganize in a much more centralized way the administration of the Roman Empire. And we'll begin next lecture with the reforms of Diocletian and Constantine. Good afternoon.